I'm going to declare it 11 o'clock because it'll take me a second to mute everybody.
Darkness.
And
Just starting.
What?
They're just
of
starting.
course, Alan will make sure that that the speakers are unmuted.
Okay, we're live.
All right. And I'm so happy to introduce, well, you all know Judy Borie, and some of you have met our guest, Sherwin Markman, and we're going to hear about his fascinating career through Judy's interview. Judy, you're on.
Thank you, Diane. Can you all hear me?
We hear you fine.
Good. And I'm not going to tell you about Sherwin. He's going to tell you about Sherwin. But I am going to tell you that my first question will set the tone for this interview. This is going to be very informal. Sherwin and I have become good friends.
Indeed.
I know a great deal about him, some of which I'm not going to tell you. But Sherwin was in the White House working for LBJ in the West Wing. I mean, that's what really gets me, having watched all 156 episodes of the
Well,
West Wing.
It
At
wasn't
least
as big, and we didn't move as fast
you didn't
as on
move fast.
television.
Okay. But Sherwin, how did it all begin?
Well, I was born and raised in Iowa, Des Moines, and never thought I'd ever be anywhere other than in Iowa. Went to high school there, went to the State University of Iowa, and the time that I actually got out of Iowa was when I discovered I had an aptitude for collegiate classes.
You had not been a star in high school?
I was the opposite of a star in high school. In high school, I had two interests, athletics and girls. School was definitely not one of them. And I don't know that I'd been accepted at any university other than University of Iowa because I happen to be a citizen of Iowa. But when I arrived at Iowa City, the most important thing for me at the moment was the track team, which I tried to join and was promptly cut. I wasn't fast enough. And so it was at that point that I suddenly discovered that I could actually do this stuff.
You mean like study?
Like study and get grades, and it was a revelation to me. And by the time I graduated in 1949, a long time ago, my grades were such that I saw that I could apply for law school places other than Iowa. And so I applied for law school at Yale and Harvard and Columbia and University of Chicago, and I got accepted
In
at
all of
them.
those places?
The first big decision of my life was where am I going to go to law school? And I decided on Yale because I thought then, and still think today, that it was the best. It was, and that's where actually the world opened up for me. I don't know how far you want me to go and how I got
I want you to go back to Iowa State. And
No, Iowa
No.
State is not,
I know,
it's the University of Iowa.
okay. No, that's right. I want you to go back to college.
Okay.
There are 3 Iowa State colleges, and I can't remember which one is which.
Well,
But
they're
don't worry about it.
okay.
Okay,
They play football against each other.
yeah. Okay, what I want you to go back is you got into politics. Weren't you president of the Young Democrats?
Yeah, as I matriculated on at the University of Iowa, I became very interested in politics. And 1948. Now that's a long time ago for anybody, most especially me. Harry Truman was running for president against Tom Dewey. And can you imagine going back that far? And as president of the University of Iowa Young Democrats, I was out campaigning for him and debating my confreres from the Young Republicans and the Young Progressives, right? Henry
So
Wallace.
that was Henry Wallace, the three-way race, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Mhm. Okay, so you also kept, when you went to Yale, one of the things that you discovered was that Iowa politics was a little different from Eastern politics.
Boy, did I discover that. At Iowa, it was no problem at all for me to get good grades, almost effortless. So then I applied for and was accepted at Yale. And suddenly I was thrown into a class where there were 125 in my law school class, where everybody was at least as smart as I was, and probably smarter and had better educations. They'd gone to first-rate universities, not that I hadn't, but it was like being thrown into ice water. And suddenly I had to work hard to get good grades, but it was an eye-opener, an educationer for me, and I'm so happy that I had that opportunity.
Well, so are we, because you certainly used it. Okay, so when you graduated, what was the message that the dean sent you? Was the dean or was it the head of the law school?
No, it was Dean Wesley Sturgis was dean of the Yale Law School, and what he told us was Yale was not there. Yale Law School is unique in that they're trying to train public leaders. They are deliberately not trying to train your regular everyday lawyer. That's why so many Yale graduates fail bar exams. They go off to California,
That's something.
and if one out of four makes it. But what they're trying to do is train public leaders. And so what Dean Sturgis was saying to us was, we're not trying to fund the big, huge law firms of New York or the government. We want you to go home, young men. It was men then. I only had 3 women in my
3 in the
100.
whole class?
class of 125. But if I go back for a reunion now, well over half are women, well over half. Any event, he told us, you go home, young men, go home, young men. And that's exactly what I did.
So you went back to Des Moines.
Went back to Des Moines.
And did you pass the bar?
I did. The Iowa bar exam was a lot easier than California. I did pass the bar and began practicing law as a trial lawyer. And
Stop a second. The trial lawyer, you always knew you wanted to be a trial lawyer. Tell us about the guy in college that taught you how to make a speech.
well, well, that's an interesting thing. Iowa had a professor, A. Craig Baird was his name, and he taught public speaking. And he had a unique approach to how a person, man or woman, should approach an audience like this when making a public speech. And what he called it was the conversational mode. If you're making a speech, you're not supposed to appear as if you're orating to somebody. You're speaking down to them. You're speaking at them. That you're supposed to at least give the impression, it's a form of acting, that you're having a conversation with the people. If it's an audience of 5 or an audience of 1,000, the impression should be between you and your listeners that you're just talking, as the 2 of us are talking
Mhm.
right now. It's unique. it's something that I adopted, and I must say, through a lifetime of speaking before juries and judges and political, it very effective, and more effective than most trial lawyers do, who do tend to this oration. Loss of testosterone among trial lawyers, to which you gotta supplement into something else.
So you knew that's what you wanted to do,
I did.
to
I
work
did.
in a courtroom or to, yeah. Okay, so you've got this nice life going on, but you got married, you had some kids, you built a house or bought a house.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. But you also were still hanging out with Democrats.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. From the very.
Well,
That's right. I consider myself a liberal, but or a moderate anyway. Among the so-called liberals or moderates at Yale, I was very, very conservative. But back in Iowa, I was a moderate, and I retained my activity in Des Moines, and became state president of the Young Democrats. And that, of course, was the opening door to what turned out to be my lifetime experience.
mhm, mhm. So you campaigned for Harry Truman, but you really got involved in 56, right?
Yeah, and
Because
boy,
you were a delegate.
this goes back so many years. 1956, I was state president of the Young Democrats of Iowa, and I campaigned for and got myself elected as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago of 1956. I didn't do anything except be a delegate, and voted for Adlai Stevenson. But I met Governor Stevens, who was governor of Illinois. I met him, became enthralled with the man, became his state campaign manager. And at the convention, the high point of my convention in 1956 was I was young. That's a high point. I was 31 years of age. And as it so happened, Miss Universe that year was Carol Morse from Iowa. And they needed somebody to escort her to the convention. And who better qualified than I? I volunteered. And so the high point was me taking Carol, a beautiful woman, as you might expect, to the convention and sort of hanging out with her for a day.
But it also got you interested in the whole national Democratic scene.
Well, yes, because I was Stevenson's campaign manager in 1956. But my close, intimate involvement with national politics really happened in 1960.
And this is when the story begins to bubble with intrigue. So tell us about we all remember who was running.
Right. Coach Jack Kennedy was had campaigned all over the United States, mostly against Hubert Humphrey. Lyndon Johnson was running, and as it happened, Adlai Stevenson was, for the third time, after being clobbered by General Eisenhower twice, was running again. So since Stevenson was running, and I'd been his Iowa campaign manager, I was on his staff. And it's that point that I really became active in trying to stop Jack Kennedy from being nominated. And it put me right at the forefront of the anti-Jack Kennedy people at that convention. The Johnson people and the Humphrey people kind of pushed me forward for reasons that are a little unclear, but that's how it ended up. And I remember Senator Kennedy calling me to his room, and the two of us having quite a intimate conversation, that the result of which he was asking me to join his staff.
In other words, switch your allegiance.
Right. And I said to him, I can't do that. I mean, I'm committed to Governor Stevenson. He said, well, others of your ilk have changed.
Others
today,
of your ilk.
have changed.
In other
And I
words, you're going
said,
to be
well,
left.
I said, I'm
behind.
not going to do it. And he said, well, you must realize Stevenson doesn't have a chance. I mean, I may or may not win, but Stevenson isn't going to win. Don't you realize that? And I remember saying to him, I do, Senator. I won't argue that, but I'm not going to switch. In that fact, I continued on my effort to stop Kennedy, and I was still working on trying to deny him delegates on the platform of the convention right up at the moment until he was nominated. And that effort of mine really angered a lot of people, the Kennedy people, who are now in charge of the party and the presidential candidate. And one of the people most angry was our then governor, Lovelace, who thought he was going to be vice president, mistakenly thought that. And I remember in the hallway,
Oh, and he thought you were responsible for him not being.
he absolutely thought I was responsible for him being replaced by Lyndon Johnson. It was crazy. It was absolute insanity. I mean, I was what, my early 30s. But he was so angry that in the halls of the convention, he met me walking past one another, and in front of the whole press, he says, you keep this up, Markman, I'm going to destroy you, you little SEB. Tough, and my own governor was saying that to me. Well, I thought that was the end of my days in politics. But as it turned out, the election between Nixon and Kennedy was close enough. They needed all the help they can get, and they forgave me.
But the other thing that happened at that convention was that you were assigned to Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, yeah. One of the great days of my life. Mrs. Roosevelt was there supporting Governor Stevenson. And I was asked to escort her around. She wanted to appear in front of various state delegations to lobby them for Stevenson. And the day I was with her was also the day that Kennedy and Johnson were going to have a televised debate in front of the Texas delegation. And that happened midday as I was escorting Mrs. Roosevelt. So she turned to me and she said, I want to watch that debate. I can't go there in person. I'm far too well known for that. Do you know of any place I can watch that debate on television? And I said, I know one place, my hotel room. Seductively. So Mrs. Roosevelt said, fine. We happened to be in that hotel in Los Angeles. So the two of us went up to my room, and I literally sat at her feet. She sat on a couch. I sat on the floor, and we watched the debate on television. And what was fascinating to me wasn't so much her comments about Kennedy versus Johnson as she started to talk about Joe Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's father. And she did not like Joe Kennedy. She thought he was a crook. She thought he'd been done this and that while her husband, President Roosevelt, had been president. And she went on and on and on. And she said, the real reason I'm against Jack Kennedy is I'm just afraid to death that if he's elected president, his father is going to have undue influence. It turned out not to be that way, but that's what she believed.
But that's what she believed. But it was also a high point of your experience.
Well, I love the afternoon that I spent with her. I mean, I was just
can't.
eating it up.
Okay, so the convention's over. And now we get to Des Moines. You're going back home.
1960, I go back home. I'm in the good graces of my party again. And then the governor who hated me lost office.
So
And
much for ruining you.
and I was still bopping along as a child and a very happy life, playing golf with Steve, my son over here. And
Now, wait a second, since you brought up golf, one of the things that Sherwin told me is he's the black sheep in golf of his
of
entire family.
well, yes. Well, first of all, I'm a lefty. That was help. But I have a first cousin who was captain of the Emory team. I have a nephew who competed against Jack Nicklaus, and when he was at the University of Michigan, I have my brother who was country club champion, and then there's me. They just put up with me. But I loved golf until I found myself in a
Found yourself not able to.
love the sport.
But okay, so you're playing golf.
Oh yeah, I had a good life. It was a good law firm and interesting practice, and it was I enjoyed it. Didn't have to work that hard.
But then in 1963, the John Birch Society came to town.
Then a very strange thing happened in Des Moines. The John Birch Society, which I'm sure all of you or most of you remember, is an ultra conservative group coming out of Texas, although I think Birch himself or the first leader was from Massachusetts. Anyway, they decided to use Des Moines as a demonstration city on how ultra right-wing politics can take over a city government. So they made Des Moines their objective, and they were going to do this by changing the form of government so that we have a strong mayor rather than a city manager. But that's beside the point. The point is they wanted to put their people in as controlling our city. And their politics and how they did it will be very, very familiar to anyone in this room, because it's very similar to some of the things you see going on now. All this is all those years ago, 1963. So they came in with lots of money. They had a radio talk show host as their leader, and out they came to change it. And the people the power structure of Des Moines, by which I mean, we had a great newspaper, the Des Moines Register, run by the Coles family, who also owned Look magazine, if you might recall it. So the people from the newspaper, the people from the Republican Party, and the people from the Democratic Party all showed up in my office and asked me if I would lead the fight against the John Birch Society, and said that we will all be behind you.
And that was the Republicans.
Republicans, Democrats, and
Everybody.
the newspaper. And I agreed. And that was the summer of 1963. And I conducted that campaign successfully. We won the election just before President Kennedy got assassinated. But the election was just horrific for me personally.
What
The
happened?
John Birches decided that their campaign strategy was going to be to make me the bad guy. So the whole campaign was not on the subject of form of government, although on my behalf, it was what was going to happen if the Birchers took over, but they came after me.
With personal,
Very personal attacks, vicious telephone calls from my family. They tried to frame me unsuccessfully of being caught with a sub-teenage girl on the banks of a river, all of which we were able to break. And actually, they went so far overboard that they lost more decisively than they ever did. But what the total effect on me was that I had it up to here with being famous or well-known or running for office. It was really to be known, and fame is a relative thing. I mean, you may not be famous nationally, but you sure as the devil could be famous in your little town of Des Moines, where I couldn't walk down the street without being recognized. And I didn't like it.
no.
But the effect of that campaign, other than souring me on running for office, was that I became very well acquainted with our governor. This is a new governor, Harold Hughes, who was running for office, maybe the best governor Iowa ever had, and was later senator from Iowa. But anyway, Harold Hughes took me under his wing. I became kind of the protege of Harold and his campaign manager. And in 1964, which is, to put a ribbon on this, directly resulted in my journey to Lyndon
Your
Johnson.
journey to this, yeah. I think we need to let Sherwin get at least a sip of water.
No, I'm fine.
Are you okay? Okay. So now we're at one of the pivotal points in your life.
That's
And I think you
very,
have to start by introducing the Mississippi Democratic.
okay. We're talking now about May and June of 1964. And there was a lot going on in the Democratic Party. I'm going to start out with the Mississippi Freedom, the African-American movement. I'm going to start with Bobby Kennedy.
Okay.
By the spring of 1964, of course, John Kennedy had been assassinated. Bobby Kennedy, who despised, no lesser word, despised Lyndon Johnson. It wasn't reciprocated, by the way. The book, I'm not going to read from a book, but there's a book
Okay. I just have to tell you,
called Mutual Contempt.
I just have to tell you that one of the rules that I set was that, as you can see, Sherwin's got some wonderful books here, and he's got marked pages. I said, you don't want to be reading to people. You want to be talking to people. I'm like your old speech teacher.
Yeah, well, the fact of the matter is, for this reason or that reason, the things I'm talking about here, there've been a lot written about them.
Oh, I guess.
These are just a few of the
And
books.
what book were you going to pull out? Because I interrupted you.
Oh, no, that's just a book called Mutual Contempt. Talks about Bobby and LBJ's. I mean, I'm no psychiatrist or psychologist, but there have been a lot of reasons why. First of all, Bobby, who I had come to know pretty well, I did come to know very well. Bobby believed with all his heart and his soul that carrying on his brother's program wasn't Lyndon Johnson's fate, should not have been. He himself, Bobby, felt that he was the one who should have carried the torch. Bobby also felt that LBJ had an inferior education, inferior socially, et cetera, and their personalities just clashed. And I mean, I saw this all the time. But in any event, in the spring of 1964, Bobby found himself didn't think Johnson would ever nominate him for vice president, which is absolutely the truth. But Bobby developed the idea that maybe he could work things around so that Bobby, could displace LBJ as the nominee of the Democratic Party in 1964. I know this is the case because Bobby's main proponent was the chairman of the Democratic Party, John Bailey, who was a Kennedy person and who had arranged everything at the convention to facilitate the nomination of Bobby and the defeat of LBJ. We discovered this in May of 1964, that the convention had been organized, that all the good, I don't know, when you watch it, old-fashioned conventions, it meant something, where state delegations were seated, who had control of the microphone, et cetera. And all of those things, seating, microphone, and the program were all arranged to facilitate Bobby's nomination. Primarily, the convention was scheduled to start with a tribute to Jack Kennedy, featuring Jackie Kennedy, followed by a speech. The first thing that happens at the convention after the tribute is a speech by Bobby Kennedy, intended to emotionally arouse the convention. And when that speech was finally given, jumping forward, when we finally got control of things, the speech was given at the end of the convention, and we were right to be concerned about it. But anyway,
It was a very good speech.
it aroused the convention like nothing else that happened at that convention. But in any event, Bobby had, with his conferers who were controlling the convention, had this ambition to be nominated and displace LBJ. That's crucial when you come to what was happening with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic. It's cynical because what they were doing was legitimate, well-earned in every respect. But nonetheless, it got tied into Bobby Kennedy versus Lyndon Johnson's ambitions. Okay. In May of 1964, the African-American community, the political activists, decided that they were going to mount a campaign to register voters in Mississippi. And to that effect, they started sending young people down there to register African Americans. Almost immediately, a tragedy ensued. 3 American kids got caught, arrested, captured, tortured, and murdered. And that was a horrific thing.
Practically the first day, wasn't it?
It was
Very,
within
very
the-
early.
It was within the first day or two. Worse than that, the American white establishment didn't want to give a damn. Senator Eastland from Mississippi told the president, this is all a fake. This is all a put-up job. There was no violence. Everything was okay. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, didn't want to put a single FBI agent into Mississippi. Nobody wanted to do anything about it. I've got a recording of Eastman's sickening defense of what was going on as he's talking to LBJ. But LBJ would have none of that. One can say what one can about Lyndon Johnson, but when it came to equality of the races, he was all there then. And so Johnson forced Hoover to send people in. They did discover that the bodies of these kids, I want to break up even remembering it, were discovered buried in a lake pit. And ultimately, the truth came out. But the battle to register African Americans in Mississippi did not succeed. It failed.
It sure did. I did a
The-
little research on that. I'm just going to interrupt you so you can take a breath. 17,000 African Americans attempted to register. 1,200 succeeded. I mean, that's pretty appalling. Anyway,
Okay, so Bobby's people, and I'm skipping a step. So the people, I'm trying to remember, the effort in Mississippi changed course. And instead of registration of blacks, they just did a 90-degree turn and decided what we're going to do is we're going to seat a non-segregated delegation at the Democratic National Convention, which will be held in August in Atlantic City. And so they formed what they call the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was a non-segregated group. They were led by two people who became quite famous. Fannie Lou Hamer was a marvelously emotive African-American woman from Mississippi. And Dr. Aaron Henry, another African-American, was a dentist who led the fight. And what they wanted was to displace the segregated Lily White delegation from Mississippi with themselves. Well, Lyndon Johnson looked at this as a vehicle for Bobby to disrupt the convention. If that fight reached the floor of the convention, according to Lyndon Johnson's belief, given his background of what he knew Bobby was trying to do, Johnson was scared to death that it would disrupt the convention, cause all sorts of hell to be raised, and change the convention from just being a reaffirmation of Lyndon Johnson to an opportunity
for Kennedy.
so therefore, Johnson wanted a compromise reached, something that would satisfy the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, satisfy the rest of the convention. He didn't give a damn about the segregated part of Mississippi, but he needed a compromise that would be accepted without a floor fight. And so he worked for months trying to get a compromise. They could not get a compromise agreed to. And so it came right up to the convention time, and about 3-4 weeks in front of the convention, he decided the compromise is going to have to be worked out by people at the convention themselves. And to that respect, he wanted two people. And so he went to his friend, colleague Hubert Humphrey, who was then senator from Minnesota, and he asked him, "Can you give me somebody who can lead this effort to negotiate a compromise?" And Hubert said, "I've got my young attorney general. His name is Walter Mondale, known as Fritz Mondale, and he'd be perfect for you." Johnson said, "Fine." Then he came to his buddy Harold Hughes, governor of Iowa, and asked him the same question. And Hughes said, I've got this young man. It was my campaign markman, and I suggest him. So Fritz and I was particularly, Fritz was more representing Hubert Humphrey, and I was representing Johnson. Were sent to Atlantic City to negotiate a compromise, which Johnson didn't think could be done. I know I came to Atlantic City and walked down the boardwalk to the headquarters that the Mississippi Freedom people had, with all of the memorabilia of the people who had been murdered
Mhm.
and injured. And it was one of the most affecting things I've ever been at. But in any event, for 5 days and nights, Fritz and I worked hard to work out a compromise. I suggested that the best compromise would be to try to convince the people from Mississippi that this isn't particularly a Mississippi problem. It's a national problem. And instead of taking delegates out of Mississippi, let's take some Mississippi Freedom Party delegates at large. And that compromise was rejected for 5 days. And then it was finally accepted. And we negotiated with the Mississippians, and we got a limited number. And that was a compromise that was accepted for the moment. Excuse me. So the whole Credentials Committee, which had authority, met on this compromise, which had been accepted by the Mississippi Freedom Party, accepted by the bulk of the convention, not accepted by the segregated Mississippians. And we were going to vote on it when suddenly the Mississippi Freedom Party people changed their minds. They didn't think that the compromise was giving them enough, and they wanted to recess the convention and renegotiate. And the chairman of that committee, the Pennsylvania Governor Lawrence, Fritz Mondale, and others were agreeable to compromise. I sat there listening to them. Nobody had consulted. I wasn't on the inside about that at all. But I knew in my heart that if they recessed that committee and threw it open, there was never going to be a compromise. And what Lyndon Johnson dreaded, a floor fight, was going to occur. So I got up at that committee meeting without really thinking about it or what I was going to say. And in the strongest possible trial lawyer voice, I strongly objected to it and persuaded them not to adjourn.
You persuaded that group to change their mind.
And the compromise was sent to the floor within an hour and adopted, and the whole fight disappeared. I'm sorry, I got dry. I'm talking far too much.
No, that's what we're here for.
Oh,
But
okay.
I think one of the things that Sherwin and I've talked about is that really was a moment in history where,
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
and it was written about. You said Drew Pearson wrote about
Oh,
it.
well, there've been a number of these books have stuff in it. It isn't often when anybody will ever have the opportunity where you'll be a fulcrum of something that happens or doesn't happen. It's happened once in my lifetime, and that was it. Where without thinking, without planning, one does something that changes the course of events. And that's what I did. In any event, Fritz and I, the compromise went through. Fritz and I were both rewarded. His was much greater than mine. He took Humphrey's place as senator from Minnesota, and I got dragged kicking and screaming onto the White House staff. So that is the short version
That's the short.
of how I got to the White House.
I think what we're going to do now, because we have a second interview next Wednesday. And that's going to be the White House years. One of the best stories Sherwin will be telling then. Well, no, I'm not going to spoil it. There are many wonderful stories, but so you just have to tune in next week or come next week. Because I keep thinking, oh, I should give him a tickle, but no. Now, we do have mics here, and we have we can't, Sherwin and I can't see.
Period.
That's right. Anyway, do you have any comments or questions or either on Zoom? I don't know how to do this. So, okay.
Hello.
I'm very curious about Lyndon Johnson and his strong feeling about civil rights. Can you talk about his personal life or his background, or where did that come
You know, that's a fascinating question that a lot of people have, and I certainly had it. You realize when he was senator, or first he was congressman, then he was senator, he was representing a southern state, and every vote he had was against civil rights. But in his heart, that wasn't Lyndon Johnson. And when he became vice president even, and certainly by the time he became president, he was a full believer in civil rights, much stronger than people ever give him credit for. There's this great story that Jack Valenti, who used to be an assistant, told. Valenti was sitting there one afternoon with Johnson and Richard Russell, who was the Democratic senator from Georgia. And Senator Russell was also the leader of all of the filibuster fights against every civil rights bill that ever was put up. And the three of Johnson and Russell are, and Russell, by the way, was sort of the mentor of Johnson when he was a young senator. So Russell says, this is Valenti's report. Russell says to Johnson, he says, Lyndon, you know, if you succeed in pushing these civil rights bills, you're going to lose the South politically forever, and you're never going to get them back. And Johnson's response was, so be it. Just one other instance to answer your question about what he was like. There's a great recording, you know, he recorded his stuff and it got released. And just before the election in 1964, Walter Jenkins, who had been his chief of staff since he'd been in the Congress, was caught in the local YMCA doing homosexual acts. Turned out to be the second time he'd been arrested for that. Of course, the president initially thought it was he'd been framed and it was a setup. It turned out to be true. And he had his friend Abe Fortas, Supreme Court Justice there, and Clark and all the big wheels advising him. But there's this recorded conversation, a long one, between Lady Bird Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. What are we going to do about Walter? With Lady Bird arguing that he served us for 30 years. We can't just dump him. And Johnson struggling with the idea of what to do with them. And the back and forth demonstrates, first of all, the relationship between Lady Bird Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. Lady Bird is not afraid to stand up to him. But also Johnson's calculating, can I do this? Can I do that? They finally gave Walter a job for life with the radio television station. But he was a complicated man. He was a complicated man. And tomorrow or next week, if I'm invited back here, I can talk about how that affected me.
And because that's going to be the whole of next week, I think.
Okay.
And go ahead, sweetie.
So next, I just want to know the process.
I'll use the mic.
Yeah.
The journey that he must have gone through from voting in civil rights acts, et cetera, to becoming what he finally became. How did it happen? What?
Well, he always felt that way. That's my point is, he was not a segregationist in his heart. He had started his career teaching disadvantaged Mexican American kids. And he always had this. And if you listen to him, if you listen or read his speeches, the "We Shall Overcome," where he adopts the African American anthem at the University of Michigan. I mean, those should convince anybody that this was Lyndon Johnson at the very heart of himself.
And I think, okay, if we've got a question back in the back,
Can yell.
that's good.
All this is just so incredibly interesting, but being a wife, I'm wondering, how did your wife and your kids manage through all of this?
Well, you can ask Steve. Well, first of all, they didn't want to leave Des Moines to go to Washington. And really, I didn't either. We had a good life. Steve was playing golf. We just joined a fancy country club. We had an architect. We're in the midst of trying to build a house. The kids were all well adjusted and liked their school. So I had to be persuasive. So I've promised all of them, and I had 3 kids, that our scale of living in Washington would not be diminished from what it had been in Des Moines. A stupid commitment. Washington was at least 3 or 4 times as expensive a place to live as Des Moines. And
And you weren't making that much
well,
money,
I
were
was
you?
making, I don't remember, but it was like $150,000 a year in Des Moines. And my salary in the White House was capped at $28,000.
Now remember, this is 1964, but still,
Well, $28,000 didn't get you much in Washington. And it was capped because Congress decided that nobody who worked for the White House could earn more money than staff members up on Capitol Hill. So there we were stuck with that. And so by the time 1968 was ending, I was broke. I mean, I spent all our savings and it was tough. And ultimately, everybody adjusted living in Washington. Steve can speak to himself. I think his biggest complaint was, if I got it right, Steve was the best thrower of passes in high school, but his coach would never let him play quarterback. Might have been different in Des Moines.
Are you taking questions over Zoom?
sure,
taking-
we don't know
Okay.
how to do it, but yes.
Well, if you can hear me now, I guess I could pose my question. This is Mark.
Yeah.
You've suggested that casual observers would be surprised by LBJ's strong supporting of a Voting Rights Act, but are you also saying that politically attentive observers would not be surprised by that strong support?
not sure I understand the question.
Can you restate that, Mark?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Stuart, you've already suggested that careful observation of LBJ would mean people would not be surprised by his strong support of voting rights and civil rights.
Right.
But I'm wondering whether that surprise would be shared by people who were careful observers of and politically attentive people, carefully observing him. Would they be surprised also by that?
Would you and you were not surprised by?
Well, yeah, I was. Anybody who didn't know LBJ would have been surprised. I mean, in Los Angeles, when Kennedy selected Johnson, I was as upset as anybody else. I mean, I was a member of Adlai Stevenson's staff. We were liberal. We thought, what in the hell is he doing?
So you, okay.
Selecting Johnson. There was a movement afoot in Los Angeles to walk out of the convention. We felt strongly.
Because
as a
of the
gentleman.
nomination of LBJ?
Right. We had no idea what this man was truly like. And we were dead set against him.
Mhm.
As it turned out, and I admit that now, I was wrong.
Mhm.
My friends were wrong. But believe me, at that moment, we were very upset.
Okay. I think we have one more question if there is one. Oh,
I want to go back to the 60 convention again and Stevenson's role. You said that you think he was bought off. I mean, you changed your support from him or away from him. Did he then become ambassador to the UN? Was that one of the
Well, that was later.
That was later.
That was after Jack was elected.
Okay, but what made him drop out, or was it just sheer
He
numbers?
was beaten. I mean, I remember the very last, we had a hotel suite in Los Angeles. And when it became obvious Kennedy was going to be nominated, I remember Stevenson climbing up on a chair, all of us of his close staff sitting on the floor, and Adelaide bringing us all to tears because he thought he would have made a really good president, and it just wasn't his fate.
mhm.
But then, he became ambassador, and I mean, I don't think he was ever satisfied with those jobs, but I mean, he wanted to be president, and he ran 3 times. And I love the guy. I love the guy.
And you thought he was good, would be a good,
All with his hole in his shoe and his. But
I was in college when he was running one of the times here, and I would ride on the subway from Brooklyn to Hunter, and New Yorkers learn to fold a newspaper so that they can read standing up when you're in a crowd even. And I remember his speeches. I would read those speeches. And I just was so impressed with Stevenson and heartbroken. He was my first vote and of course didn't win. But I just thought his intelligence and his thoughts just grabbed me as a college kid.
Well,
Thank
I
you,
love
Muriel.
the man myself. I was willing to sacrifice my own political career to continue with him until the very end.
Could I say something? It's Barbara on Zoom.
sure.
I remember vividly crying my eyes out the night he gave that speech and had lost the nomination. I can still remember it to this day.
And it is 12 o'clock. Sherwin, I've been telling people you're amazing, but
Oh,
you've
please.
just proved it. Are you not completely? Let's give him a hand.
Thank you, Judy and Sherwin, and we very much are looking forward to next week.
You are just amazing.
Everyone, you do have another book coming out, a memoir perhaps.
Okay, we done.
Okay,
Thank
we're-
you. Thank you, everybody, for your close attention.